China had spent the last 3 days making clear statements to the world, to the various countries it seeks to attract to its orbit, and of course to Donald Trump's America. The bit that certainly caught Trump's attention, and was the biggest visual spectacle, was the military parade. So, although it's actually not the most important part, let's cover that first. One thing we know is that Donald Trump loves him a military parade. He did, after all, insist on having one all of his own in Washington, D.C., because it's how strongmen leaders are supposed to behave, or something. And the US military, of course, is the strongest and most experienced in the world, so ought therefore to be able to put on the greatest show in the world. Now, we don't know what thoughts were going through Trump's mind as he was remembering his own parade, which looked like this.
Legends to service members and civilians alike, they take on terrorists.
And comparing it to Xi Jinping's version, which looked sort of more like this. You don't have to support the Chinese Communist Party in any way to objectively acknowledge that they certainly lead the world in the spectacle of military parades. We do know that Trump went onto social media to accuse Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, from using the opportunity to, quote, conspire against the United States. And you could read in that his affronted pride that these strongmen leaders, whose orbits he has tried to insert himself into, are showing that they do not see him as their fellow, and that they are standing in solidarity as an alternative to his worldview. That was Trump's take, which, as usual, of course, is all about himself. Now, the people who don't habitually tweet in all caps would have been watching the parade with detailed interest to evaluate what weapons were on show that were new to the party. Because whereas it used to be the received wisdom that China was all about copying others, catching up, it's now become clear to everyone it has reached the point where it is doing the innovating and, in some areas at least, leading. China has been investing in new hardware for its military at a rapid pace. While its spending is below that of the United States, what it's been getting for that money seems to be outstripping the value that the US is managing. What those observers would have been noticing watching this parade would be, for instance, the Dongfeng 61, China's most advanced nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile, which was here for the first time, along with a number of other air-launched and submarine-launched similar missiles. They will have been noting the appearance of anti-drone defences, such as the FK-351 system. The Chinese have been close observers of the war in Ukraine, have come to the conclusion, as has most of the rest of the world military community, that future wars will be much more fought by autonomous weapons of various sorts. And particularly, they'd seen how drones made short work of Russia's heavy lumbering tanks. So they brought in their lighter, more manoeuvrable and well-defended tanks that are intended to be less vulnerable to such attack. Observers will have seen for the first time at this parade the LY-1, a huge shipborne laser able to target and bring down enemy aircraft. And then the ones that probably worry the US military the most, the hypersonic anti-ship missiles. Traditional US military might has been projected around the world by its massive, well-defended aircraft carriers. If the US decided to embark on direct armed conflict with China, say in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, such aircraft carriers would be the key platforms used for operations. Except that such aircraft carriers are currently rated to be more or less helpless in the face of hypersonic missiles. Indeed, Pete Hegseth was relating, when he was still a Fox News TV host, how on the opening of such hostilities, China may well be in a position where it could take out all of America's aircraft carriers within the first 20 minutes. This is when you start to realise that just because the US spends way more on defence than China doesn't necessarily buy guaranteed superiority. An aircraft carrier, along with all that comes with it, costs a great deal more than even an advanced hypersonic missile. Just the same as big battlefield tanks cost a lot more than the drones that successfully took them out. So yes, the point of a Chinese military parade is to project this sort of power, for that power to be clearly seen and understood by those who might choose to see themselves as adversaries, and ideally, in the Chinese approach to war that has historically held, to thereby deter any such action ever taking place. And this leads to the vulnerability on the Chinese side as well, because these things are complicated. Yes, it currently has some advantages over the US because it's strategically analysing the conflicts between others, assessing what works, what doesn't, what disruptive technologies seem to be the most effective, and it's easier to build a new military on such studies than it is for an old establishment to pivot and to abandon some of its expensive redundant assets, and particularly its old mindset. But also, this massive military that demonstrates it can march and chant in much more disciplined ways than Americans would ever think they wanted to, it is nevertheless untested in battle. And you don't really know what will fail until you've tried and failed. Yes, they've tried to do what organisations often badly do, to learn from the mistakes of others. So they learned reportedly from the Ukraine war and Russia's earlier humiliations when the assault on the country was routed, that one of the key factors isn't just the forces and the technology, but the integration and coordination between the different agencies. So, for instance, without land forces and air support working tightly together, then you fail. So that's the military and the weapon side. Yes, they looked powerful, but they weren't even the optics that made the most impact from this event. That was the carefully choreographed sight of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un walking together towards the podium. That was what really grabbed the attention. It was a statement to the world. No Western powers were represented at this event, although plenty of others from the global south certainly were, bringing up the rear of those three. And that followed the two-day economic summit, where China hosted more than 20 leaders, including Narendra Modi of India, to discuss the world as they saw it. That event was marked by a speech by Xi Jinping as he outlined China's ambition, which he sees as now enjoying increasing momentum as a result of the actions of the Trump administration, to reshape the world order to its own advantage and to that of its allies. So he used that event to launch what he described as the Global Governance Initiative, founded on 5 principles that, while not naming Trump or the US specifically, stood in stark contrast to the behaviours of the Trump administration. So these were: first, sovereign equality, that all countries, regardless of size, strength and wealth, are equal participants in global governance. Second, the international rule of law based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, applied, he said, with no double standards. Third, multilateralism. Global governance comes with extensive consultation and joint contribution. No unilateralism in imposing standards on the world. Fourth, a people-centered approach, tackling the common challenges for humankind wherever they live, narrowing the north-south gap specifically. Fifth, turn all of that into real action, mobilizing resources to have visible outcomes. Now, you might note that not only does that list stand in stark contrast to the behaviours of the United States, particularly but not exclusively during the Trump administration, but, well, it also does so to the behaviours of Russia as well, amongst others. And sometimes, dare I say, China itself, although it is Russia that is specifically fighting a bloody war on the principle that only strong nations are sovereign and can therefore impose their will on their neighbours. So it's worth being clear-sighted about the pitch and the complex realities behind it. China wants to persuade the global south countries to gather behind its standard, to support it becoming their superpower. And so this list is the principles behind that promise. They arguably lifted the promises that America originally made with the founding of the rules-based world order, now that they've worked their way into embodying the exact opposite with the onset of Trumpism. China has seen for some years that it was rising inexorably within that existing system, and that the US was declining relentlessly within that system as it lost touch with the benefits of it. So the last thing it really wanted was a Russian-style break-the-system approach, even while it manages to smile benignly on such activity as far as it undermines cohesion within Western democracies. What Xi Jinping has been rather struggling with, though, is that many in the global south have been, shall we say, unenthusiastic about the idea of lining up alongside China in opposition to the United States. A number of countries, such as India and South Africa, had been seeking studied neutrality. Not queuing up to make a pariah out of Russia for the Ukraine war, sure, but equally not signing up to the idea of China as an alternative hegemon. That really reflects itself in the uneasy relationship in recent years between India and China, and one reason why Trump's alienation of Narendra Modi, leading to him attending Xi's summit earlier, but not his military parade note, is very interesting. India and China both see themselves as emerging powers, and that naturally creates tension between them, not least because they have a disputed border. The US had for decades the idea that it was of high strategic priority to develop a special relationship with India as a counterbalance to China's influence in the global south. India always pushed back against that role, but that was the strategic aim, which kind of made sense from the perspective of how the United States saw the world and its place within it. Then, of course, the President of the United States took offence, because the Prime Minister of India refused to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, seriously. And dismissed Trump's fantastical claims to have had a major role in ending the flare-up in fighting with Pakistan. By all accounts, that, more than anything to do with the buying of Russian oil, is why Trump turned on Modi, slapping 50% tariffs on India and turning up the heated invective. That, of course, was supposed to bully India into compliance. But that's not how major emerging powers seem to be responding to such tantrums, so far anyway. Instead, India has become notably warmer towards China and other partners from the BRICS nations. And reportedly, now Narendra Modi won't even take President Trump's phone calls. But there are still limits. When Russia and China have tried to mobilize the BRICS countries more actively into a counterweight to the US, for example by signing up to promoting an alternative global reserve currency to the dollar, they have largely balked, and the new entrants to the BRICS seem more resistant to the idea of being used to that counterweight. And with China's growing military, and with it increasingly throwing its weight around in the South China Sea, as well as globally in terms of trade, many Southeast Asian countries have likewise been wary to date of crowning it as the new hegemon. Hence, you would have to think why Modi was happy to attend the economic summit, but to be discreetly excused from the military parade. But Trump is changing the balance for the smaller and the more vulnerable nations. And while some of them remain wary, the fact is that most Southeast Asian countries were present at the military parade and indeed for the economic summit. That tells its own story. Trump has been actively extorting them, to their great discomfort. Xi Jinping's message of return to the rules-based order, even if China remains the first amongst equals, still sounds pretty good to them as a comparison. As good a summary of the different worldviews comes from how US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent reacted to the summit, and how Xi Jinping summarised it in his speech to the military parade afterwards. Bessent said the gathering was, quote, performative, and he labelled India and China as bad actors and said that they were fueling the Russian war machine. Very black and white, very our way is the right way, and the accusation may have some accuracy, but the fact that he didn't actually label Russia itself as a bad actor, since it was also present, rather tells you everything you need to know about that as an attack from this administration. But you can see in that response the hostility of the side that is seeing power draining away from itself and starting to accrue in fora where they aren't even invited. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping, in his speech to the military, as much as his opening to the economic summit that preceded it, didn't mention the US specifically. But he kind of didn't have to. So he said this: humanity is again faced with a choice of peace or war, dialogue or confrontation, and win-win outcomes or zero-sum games. Zero-sum games. Can't imagine who he might be referring to. The Chinese people will stand firmly on the right side of history and on the side of human progress, adhere to the path of peaceful development, and join hands with the rest of the world to build a community with a shared future for humanity. Now look, a shared future for humanity used to be the vision of the United States, however imperfectly realised. And it's why it created the United Nations, why it invested in USAID with a view to spreading stable democratic practices as the world standard, believing that would enable the world to develop better, and that would be to everyone's benefit, including the United States. Now it has dismantled USAID, it is demanding that all the countries whose economies are less strong than its own give it even more money and enter one-sided economic relationships just because it can. It makes a feature out of not caring if poor people die across the world, because to do so would apparently not be America first enough. Not only that, national leaders going to meet with Trump in the White House know that they risk being humiliated in a scrappy free-for-all in front of the global media. Contrast that with the respect and dignity which China went out of its way to show to all the visiting leaders in this case. Again, most of them don't fall for the idea that that means China isn't just as capable of using its strength and despising the weakness of others. And don't forget, it is aligned with Russia, which has been the worst might makes right actor in the world in recent history. But even so, the last 3 days have been a pretty effective PR operation for the would-be emergent global superpower. And after all that, I would say the key takeaways are this. 1. China is building its military to the point where it believes it won't have to use it to fight wars, because the local arena where it's projecting its strength will see its overwhelming superiority and believe that that means that nobody will fight it. And it aims to reach a point where the United States joins in with that conclusion when it comes to Taiwan and other areas that fall outside America's top strategic focus. 2. The major powers of the Global South are consolidating their joint position in defiance of Trump. Trump's tariff wars, his insults and other measures are pushing China and Russia and India and North Korea and Brazil into the role of the champions of the Global South who refuse to bow down before the bully. That is Trump's wholly unforced error and his gift to his adversaries. Expect to see him pushing back and getting increasingly frustrated and angry as this dynamic continues to develop. As we know, he insists that everything in the world should be revolving only around him. So the more that power ebbs away, the more the focus goes with it, the more furious he will become. In the absence of any self-awareness as to what he himself did to accelerate that trend, expect it to get rather noisy and messy.